Virginians want and deserve a state budget that invests in our future and meets our needs in a responsible way. This is Celia Tetlow with the Commonwealth Institute, and I'm joined by Michael Cassidy, President of the Commonwealth Institute, to share this presentation that takes stock of recent budget actions by Virginia lawmakers and assesses how well they're doing in meeting that goal.
Thank you, Celia. Unfortunately, the compromise budget that passed in September relies on cuts, gimmicks, and passing down the problems to our families and local governments, rather than taking a balanced approach that includes the resources we need to build the economy and meet the current and future needs of our Commonwealth. As we move forward toward the next legislative session in January, we need to let our policymakers know that we need an effective, long-term plan for balancing our state budget, one that includes new revenues, ends the practice of passing budget shortfalls down to our localities, and avoids the harmful cuts that cost us jobs and undermine our future. Let's start by looking at what just happened with the state revenue shortfall and the recently adopted budget compromise. When legislators met in September, the budget agreement had already been hashed out behind closed doors by legislative leadership and the administration. Rather than taking a close look at all the options they had to raise revenue, lawmakers adopted a cuts-only approach that also draws down the state's rainy day fund to low levels. They also used one-time budget tricks to make ends meet, even though this does little to solve Virginia's long-standing revenue problems. While Virginia's economic growth has slowed down, we are decidedly not in a recession. That means that we should be building up the state's rainy day fund right now. But we're not. Instead, we're drawing it down. Entering the last recession, we had nearly $1.2 billion in the state's rainy day fund. We needed and used that money to maintain vital services during the hardest years of the recession and its aftermath. The current budget plan to withdraw over $700 million from that fund this year and next year will leave Virginia's budget exposed to more problems down the line. Meanwhile, the budget compromise also included cuts to the state's colleges and universities, local governments, and state agencies. State agencies in Virginia have been tasked with cutting $192 million from their budgets over the next 2 years, and the recently adopted budget agreement puts in place something that's not clear exactly where these cuts will fall. Instead, the final decision on cuts will be made by the administration, based on budget reduction plans submitted by state agencies. Some of these cuts might be relatively benign, like finding ways to negotiate cheaper contracts for services. Other cuts might not have too obvious an immediate impact, but will come home to roost in the future. For example, putting off replacing equipment might look quite benign, but the older equipment may reduce our state employees' productivity, and at some point, we're going to have to pay the cost of replacing those tools. The last type of cuts are those that will have an immediate impact on Virginia's families and communities, like we would see if the cuts reduce support for local libraries or state highway safety measures. As we gain more information about the specific cuts in each area of the budget, it will be very important to watch for which of these three types of cuts are occurring in state agency budgets. Virginia's state colleges and universities are facing cuts of $45 million per year, and they've been told not to make up for those lost funds by charging students more. Smaller, less well-endowed schools are seeing their state funding cut less, but all of these institutions are going to have to find a way to make up for these losses. And it's likely that higher tuition, fees, and fewer course offerings could be on the way, putting higher education out of reach for more middle-class and low-income families and students. Localities are also being asked to give back a portion of the funding they receive from the state. They're expected to cut $60 million from their budgets in the next 2 years. And while state lawmakers assert that they have managed to protect K-12 education from this round of cuts, local governments have discretion to cut wherever they want. Education spending typically makes up more than half of local government budgets, making it hard to imagine how local governments keep education out of the budget-cutting crosshairs. And we can't forget that education spending is supported by other areas of local spending that will likely to be facing cuts as well. Cuts to libraries, health and social services, and public safety will, without a doubt, make themselves known in the classroom. Finally, the budget compromise also relied on a variety of one-time gimmicks and sweeping up of fund balances. These techniques might have helped close the revenue shortfall that was facing Virginia this fall, but they don't provide the kind of ongoing revenue Virginia needs for the future. For example, despite their talk of protecting K-12 education, state budget writers are decreasing state general fund support for school divisions by $43 million, substituting it instead with money from the state lottery and deeper withdrawals from the state literary fund. The Virginia Constitution gives lawmakers little room to spend money from the lottery and literary funds on anything other than education. So this money would have been used in our schools in some way, even if it was not appropriated in this particular budget. But instead, budget writers used these funds to cover up a reduction in their state support for public education. Another questionable source of one-time money to close the shortfall was delaying the ramped-up diversion of sales tax revenue over to transportation. Part of last year's comprehensive budget transportation package that was adopted diverted a portion of the state's sales tax over to the Highway Maintenance and Operation Fund. The budget that was passed in June held on to $30 million of that, promising to pay it back to the Transportation Fund next year. This budget agreement goes even further. It delays all of the diversion, almost $50 million. This may retain critical resources for the state's general fund, but it's just a one-time fix, not a long-term solution. The state has refinanced some of its debt and captured savings by paying lower interest rates as well. Over the course of the current budget, they expect to save as much as $26.2 million in this way. And in addition to all of these cuts, lawmakers are taking advantage of about $102 million in unused balances at state agencies to help them with their operating expenses.
So that's where we are. Now let's take a step back and ask, why did we face another shortfall after a budget passed this June that had almost no new spending?
The bottom line, Celia, is we don't have enough revenue, and that's due to both long-term and short-term reasons. The long-term story has two parts. First, our state's revenue system has not been keeping up with the changes in Virginia's economy, resulting in not having enough money to make the investments we need for Virginia's future. For example, Virginia's state sales tax doesn't cover most services, which are a growing share of the state's economy. As a result, sales tax revenue is eroding compared to the growth of the overall economy. Second, during the tough economic years, during and after the Great Recession, our state lawmakers have chosen to balance Virginia's budgets almost entirely through cutting services and budget gimmicks, rather than raising significant new revenue to meet the growing needs of a growing state. This has put Virginia's revenue way off track compared to the state's longer-term trends and revenue growth rates. If policymakers had closed loopholes or modernized Virginia's revenue system, so that we were bringing in today as much revenue as a share of the state's personal income as we were at pre-recession levels, then we would have $2 billion more in revenue for each year. That's more than enough to fill the shortfall that we faced this summer and fall, with money left over to restore some of the services that were cut during the recession. The short-term story with Virginia's revenue shortfall, which you've read about in the news, stems from a combination of revenue misforecasts and an even slower than expected economic recovery in the state. While rising federal employment helped Virginia weather the recession better than most other states, recent federal budget cuts have meant Virginia's recovery has stalled. Together, the misforecasting of state tax revenue and slower than expected economic growth reduced revenue in Virginia in the recently completed fiscal year by $440 million, and it's expected to reduce revenue by about $1 billion more in the current and upcoming fiscal years. So where does this all leave us? Well, the decisions by Virginia policymakers to allow revenue to decline has severely eroded Virginia's level of investment across the board. After we adjust for factors like growing school enrollment, the additional need for Medicaid due to the weak economy, and general inflation, we see that our level of general fund investment this year is about $5.6 billion below 2007 levels. And next year, it'll be $6.2 billion below 2007 levels, a new post-recession low point. This has real consequences for our families and our communities. For example, we now have more students in our public schools than ever before, but the state has tweaked its funding formula so that they now provide less money per pupil. Funding for K-12 is down by over $1 billion a year compared to 2007 levels, after adjusting for inflation and growing school enrollment. State per pupil direct aid for public education, which is the heart of the state's support for our K-12 schools, will fall 17% by next school year compared to the 2008-2009 school year. And the state's diversion of money from the lottery and literary funds has resulted in a drop in state support for school construction. We are now looking at 8 straight years of the literary fund being used entirely to make up for cuts in state general fund support for public education, rather than fulfilling its original mandate to enhance the education of Virginia's children. With the state pulling back from funding its share of key areas like public education, Virginia local governments, families, and communities are left trying to pick up the pieces. As you can see, Virginia localities have been increasing their share of the costs of education for Virginia's children, and we expect this to get worse in the coming years.
So that's where we stand. But how do we move forward? Virginia continues to face significant challenges, including a remaining revenue shortfall of $272 million in an uncertain economic recovery.
That's right, Celia. And as the General Assembly addresses these challenges in the upcoming session, it's imperative that they do so in ways that protect families and prepare us for a prosperous future. As advocates and constituents, we have several opportunities in the next few months to make our voices heard. And we need to start acting now to make sure that when the General Assembly meets in January to make further changes to the state budget and to close that $272 million hole, we avoid additional cuts. And we need to work to restore some of our investments in K-12 education, higher ed, and everything else that we know builds an economically prosperous future. This fall, advocates can contact the governor as he works to craft proposed revisions to the 2-year budget that will run through July 1st, 2016. since prior shortfall closing measures have been almost entirely cuts, borrowing, and one-time gimmicks, a balanced approach would see that all of the remaining $272 million shortfall is filled by using new revenue. This fall is a good time also to be meeting with your local delegates and senators in their home offices to deliver the message of using new revenues to close the remaining budget shortfall. The most important legislative players in deciding key state budget issues are members of Virginia's House Appropriations Committee and Senate Finance Committee, also known as the Money Committees. Meeting with members of these committees can be particularly effective. It always helps if legislators can put a name and a face to your issues before they head to Richmond. Key dates to remember are the November Money Committee retreats, which run from November 18th through the 21st, December 17th, when the governor publicly announces his budget revisions, and January 14th, when the 2015 legislative session begins.
In addition, this fall, advocates from across the state will gather on November 12th at a policy summit hosted by the Commonwealth Institute to hear more about these and other challenges, hear from Governor McAuliffe, as well as leading policy experts about the challenges and opportunities facing the state. And participants will get new tools to advance their work in the coming session. Register today at www.thecommonwealthinstitute.org.
Thank you for viewing this presentation today. And as always, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to contact us.